You're listening to the Corbett Report. CorbettReport.com.
All right, welcome back to the program, friends. Welcome back to Corbett Report Radio. You are tuned into the Republic Broadcasting Network, and I'm your host for this evening, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. And once again, I'm joining you from the sunny climes of Western Japan, where it's already the 7th of September 2012. But tonight we are traveling electronically to the west coast of the United States, where we are joined on the line tonight by Maira Sutton of the EFF, which is the Electronic Frontier Foundation at EFF.org. And Maira Sutton is the International IP Coordinator for the EFF, and she works with the EFF's international team, blogging, developing campaigns, and monitoring emerging trends and developments in international intellectual property and innovation policies, which is quite a mouthful. So, Maira, it's great to have you on the program tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is your first time on the program, and in fact, the first time a representative of the EFF has been on this radio program. I've talked to people from the EFF before for my website, but not for the radio program yet. So there might be some listeners out there who are unfamiliar with the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the work that you're doing there. So I would direct people to EFF.org if they haven't gone there before, because there is a wealth of information on privacy issues, intellectual property, other things that are affecting people as more and more of our life is becoming online and digitized. But perhaps just in the first few minutes here, you could introduce us to the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the work that you do there.
Sure. So we're a digital rights organization. We've been around for almost 23 years, fighting for internet users and technology users around the world. We are consisted of a sort of a diverse group of people. Half of us are lawyers. Take on cases in which we see digital rights are being infringed upon, whether it's a privacy matter, a free speech matter, or an innovation matter. And so we've taken on a lot of cases, and we like to credit ourselves with creating some positive precedents in terms of digital rights law. We also have a technology group, technologists that are developing privacy tools and also explain these often very intricate digital issues to the lawyers so that they can actually accurately describe what the stakes are in many of these cases. Because often what happens is if we're dealing with, for example, a state law, many of even the legislators that create these laws don't understand what's going on. So our job is to create good law, both on the domestic front and I'm on the international team. So what we do is we are at the UN, we are at many of these international fora to describe and to, influence good digital policy around the world. And as we will talk about, there are many trade agreements that are beginning to regulate the internet as sort of a consequence of increased intellectual property law. And that's my area. We also have activists and policymakers who are working in the privacy space and free speech space, of course. I think that's about it.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, you do cover such a wide range of material there, and I can attest to the handiness of the EFF website for introducing people at large to some of these issues. It's where, for example, I learned about tools like HTTPS Everywhere, which is one of the tools that I recommended here on the radio program last week. So lots of information on all sorts of digital rights concerns. And as you say, you're working specifically on the IP issue, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight as we start discussing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, one of those international trade deals which not a lot of people know about, but which has the potential to bring about some very vastly different and new regulations on the international IP front. So very important for people who are using the internet and people like myself who use it to communicate with people around the world. Some very big ramifications. Well, we're coming up against our first break, so let's take a breather. But when we come back, we'll continue this conversation with Maira Sutton of EFF.org talking about the TPP. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. You're tuned into Corbett Report Radio, and tonight we are talking to Maira Sutton of the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And we're talking specifically tonight about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, something that we've alluded to here on the broadcast before, but I want to get into in some more depth. So, Maira, let's start off just with a general introduction for people out there who are not familiar with the TPP and what it is. Let's talk about what is the scope of this agreement and what does it really cover.
So, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is a multilateral trade agreement, which means it's being negotiated between many countries, specifically 9 countries, and it covers everything from textiles to milk to tobacco, and one of those chapters covers intellectual property, which is the problematic chapter for us. So there are 2 issues actually. So it's the intellectual property chapter that carries many of these very restrictive copyright provisions. The other problem is the fact that they are negotiating this very large, potentially powerful agreement behind closed doors. And none of us in civil society know what's actually in this agreement. And we wouldn't know without any of these leaked text that has been occurring. In February 2011, the entire intellectual property chapter that they were negotiating was leaked. And actually, a month ago, a chapter, the proposals that the U.S. and Australia is pushing forward was also leaked. So it's very problematic for us because they are seeking to create a very, very comprehensive agreement without anybody in civil society really participating. I can go into more of the specifics. In terms of the actual meetings, the meetings have actually started today in Leesburg, Virginia, and EFF will be there this weekend, and we'll be monitoring what's going on there.
Excellent. And for people who are interested, the text of both of those leaked draft documents are available on the EFF website?
I believe so. I'll have to follow up with some
well, I can see a link to the February 2011 draft text, but I don't see the latest leak, so perhaps not.
I mean, so the problem there is that, because it's a trade agreement and they're continuing to negotiate this text, we have this chapter of this agreement, but it could be very outdated for as far as we know. So, the United States Trade Representative, which is leading these negotiations, continue to claim that they are, allowing us to participate in these negotiations, but they haven't officially released any of these texts, so there's really no participation or transparency that's going on here. So the only opportunity that civil society have to, I guess, talk to the delegates, the delegates of all the countries are these direct stakeholder events, that's what they call them, and it pretty much consists of 2 things: a tabling event where all the civil society groups and even private corporations like FedEx and even Occupy actually are there, and they sort of set up tables, sort of like a college fair, a job fair or something. It's sort of silly, and we just sort of have to wait there and wait for the delegates to stride by our table, hopefully being interested in what we have to say, and so that's part of it. The other half is these presentations that we need to register for both of these things, but we must register for these presentations, and they are an opportunity for us to sort of just speak directly at the delegates and to say, explain our specific concerns with this agreement. In San Diego in the beginning of July, we had 15 minutes each to talk about our concerns. This time we only got 8 minutes and then 10 minutes. They're sort of cutting down public participation every round. Even as they write on their blog, we're so public, we're so transparent with all this stuff. But it's really not sufficient to for us to talk about the extensive problems with this very powerful trade agreement.
Well, let's start talking about some of those problems, because as you say, the leaked draft texts at least give us an idea of what types of issues they're working on and what proposals they're considering. So let's talk about some of the specific points in the IP chapter, the intellectual property chapter, that have you so concerned.
All right. So the TPP would not extend U.S. Policies as much as it would for the rest of the signatory countries. That's because we have one fairly good case law that that protects and I guess pushes back against the restrictions that copyright enacts. And two, because we have fairly flexible fair use. And so the most latest leak that we got last month was related to what we call exceptions limitations. Exceptions limitations are exceptions to copyright, and these exceptions are things like education and for libraries, things like that put a limit to these enforcement measures in copyright to ensure that even if material is copyrighted, necessary institutions like schools can have access to such content. While we were in San Diego in July, they suddenly released a blog post out of nowhere that they would enact fair use into the TPP. There was no fair use in the TPP before then, so it seemed like good news at first, but when we looked at the actual provision that they were talking about, they call this thing the three-step test. And what this three-step test, to summarize, it sort of limits the kinds of fair use that other countries can enact in their own countries. So instead of each country being able to determine, what kind of exceptions to copyright do we want to make so that we protect these vital institutions, it sort of ties the hands of each of these countries from being able to make those determinations. So the U.S. is unfortunately pushing forward these restrictions on fair use, and that has a very broad implication for the many other side effects of this IP provision. There are more specific problems. One provision of the IP chapter regulates temporary copies. So when you watch a video on the internet, on YouTube or anything, it has to temporarily save a file on your computer so you can actually literally see it on your screen. The way that the language of the TPP is written is very broad, and so there are some very heavy implications and broad interpretations that can arrive from such broad language that regulates any video that you watch on YouTube. So essentially, if you watch a copyrighted video, you could be determined to have infringed on copyright, and that's pretty ridiculous. Other things such as the extension of copyright itself. So in many of these countries, they have different varying lengths of copyright, but this trade agreement, the TPP, would extend it to 70 years in addition to what they already have, or 120 years after the publication of content. And if you think about the underlying purpose for copyright, it's to promote creativity, to promote innovation. And when you have these copyright terms that sort of go even beyond the lifespan of an individual's, an individual life, what kind of incentive is that to preserve, a copyright for that long? You're really just blocking out the public from being able to access content, access culture and innovation and technology in a lot of situations. And in copyright, the point is to balance those rights, to balance the right of the individual creator or the innovator, and to protect their rights over their idea or their innovation, so that they can feel like they are getting a return on the investment they made into this creation. And the other side is the public that should have access to that idea and that technology. So as of now, what's going on is the rights of the copyright owner is getting stronger and stronger because frankly, industry lobbyists, Hollywood, music studios, a lot of these companies have a lot of money and they have a lot of lobbying power, and they can strengthen their copyright power and shift the balance towards them much more than the public can empower themselves to ensure that they have access to that. And so our role is to make sure that that balance is stricken, and as of now it's very unbalanced.
Unfortunately so, and you talk about the lack of public input and transparency in this process. What do we know about corporate input into this negotiation?
Well, as far as we know, many corporate lobbyists know what's going on. For one example, the February round of the February round of the TPP negotiations was in Beverly Hills. It was in this fancy hotel, and while civil society, we were actually denied access to even the hotel. So many of us reserved hotel rooms in the hotel where the negotiations were happening, and we were mysteriously denied reservations for those rooms. So on the one hand,
unfortunately, you got cut off by the music there. We're going to have to come up, take another break. We're coming up against one right now. So let's just hang on for just 1 second. We'll come back talking again tonight to Maira Sutton of the EFF, EFF.org. I hope people will go there and check it out. There's tons of information there about the TPP. Let's take a short breather. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back, friends. This is James Corbett, CorbettReport.com. You are tuned into Corbett Report Radio, and tonight we're discussing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and the potential to really regulate and start regulating the internet on an international scale through agreements like this that are taking place in negotiations that are being conducted behind closed doors and with very little public input whatsoever. So tonight we're discussing some of these issues with Maira Sutton of the EFF, and just before the break we were talking about some of the indications that there is corporate input into this process, whereas we've already discussed the fact that there is very little public input. So Maira, let's pick up with the point you were making there before the break.
Right. So I was telling a story about how in February, civil society people were denied hotel rooms at the place where they were holding these negotiations. At the same time, the very next day, the delegates got a extensive tour of Hollywood studios and a cocktail hour. So no doubt they were schmoozing and talking about I'm sure the agreement and what they'd sort of like to see there. And every single round, these Hollywood music industry folks and movie industry folks have been putting on these, extravagant parties and things like that. So there is a lot of corporate influence there. And, as civil society and as a nonprofit, we don't have money to throw at this, so we have limited resources to really make an impact. And even sending ourselves out across the country to DC, I'm in San Francisco, is a big deal. So there is a gross imbalance in the amount of influence that corporate interests are playing in this versus the civil society. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely right. There is an imbalance there, and I think it's one of the worrying things. Of course, the EFF does rely on the support of people out there. How do people support the EFF if they want to help that work?
Well, we have a donate page, and we have several fundraisers. We actually get a lot of funding from this thing called Humble Bundle. It's a platform for independent game developers to bundle their games and for users and consumers to pay as much as they'd like. And we are fortunately one of the nonprofits that are on that platform. And you can get great independent video games and also support EFF at the same time. It's called Humble Bundle. So that's one way. We barely get any funding from Google or these big, companies, maybe for an event, but none for, some specific cause or purpose. So we really value member support.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about what the internet might look like if this type of legislation was passed in the form that we've seen in the draft texts. What would be different from the way people experience the internet now, and what are some of the potential dangers?
Well, as we saw earlier this year with SOPA and PIPA, and maybe you've heard of ACTA, many of these policies would have a gross impact on the way people experience the internet. As I said, the temporary copies provision could profoundly change the way people can, watch videos on the internet. As we've seen this week with, a lot of the coverage with the conventions and the Olympics even, we're starting to see these robo cops that are policing copyrighted content, and that has huge implications for free speech. If they keep mistakenly taking down content because if it's in some sort of database that is registered as being copyrighted, there's no limit to what kind of content could be automatically shut down based upon what it says. So many of these technologies that are being put in place to enforce copyright could actually be, sort of abused. And, who knows, especially in some countries that might sign on to the TPP, aren't maybe as democratic and transparent as the U.S. is. And so if they start to build this technological infrastructure to police content that is being put on the internet, it might become very easy for them to censor political or religious speech at a whim. One of the provisions of the TPP is very similar to the U.S. Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and actually goes beyond the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in the way that it forces internet service providers, the company that you pay for the internet, to actually be responsible for the content that you are seeing. And we call those ISPs, we also call them internet intermediaries, because they are the intermediary between you and the content. And they, if they are forced to be responsible for what you are seeing, they will start to take measures to see what you are seeing. And so there'll be things like 3 strikes laws, so that if they can determine that you are, maybe downloading content that might be copyrighted or whatever it is, and they find.
Once again, sorry, we're coming up against the break there. We got cut off there by the music. So let's regroup our senses. We're going to take another few-minute break, but we'll be right back. Once again, talking to Maira Sutton of the Electronic Frontier Foundation at EFF.org. And tonight we're talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And I will, of course, as always, put some links in the show notes for tonight's episode at corbettreport.com/radio. Stay tuned right there. We'll be right back.
It starts with you and me. It starts with you and me.
All right, welcome back to the broadcast, friends. Welcome back to Corbett Report Radio. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. Tonight, if you're just joining us, we're talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, a multinational trade agreement that threatens, well, to create a number of laws on an international scale, including laws on intellectual property. So tonight we're talking to Maira Sutton of the Electronic Frontier Foundation at EFF.org about some of the issues that are involved in this agreement and some of the potentials for a very dark future for internet and digital freedoms generally. So Maira, just before the break, you were making a point about ISPs and the man in the middle. Let's pick up from that and start talking about some of these implications.
Right. So as I was saying, this ISP liability provision could force internet service providers to take down content extrajudicially. So that would mean that they would determine on their own, using whatever means, maybe these new robo takedown processes, or by actually using your IP to monitor what content you're downloading, which obviously has some huge privacy implications, and to determine if you are downloading content. And based upon those determinations, they could kick you off the internet for whatever length. Maybe you might have to pay a big fee, or who knows what kind of policies that they might want to enact, because they're going to do whatever it takes for them not to be held accountable for your actions, and that's really dangerous. For whatever crime that you might do, there needs to be a third party involved. And so if a ISP is held accountable to do this on their own, there's no balance with that, and there's no other party to determine whether this is actually a true allegation. So that is very dangerous. And in the U.S., we've lived with the DMCA for a long time, and even here with the DMCA, we've seen many of these provisions getting abused and having been taking down content that is actually purely legitimate. And the fact that I mentioned earlier, that there's no fair use that is in these countries, and the fact that that three-step test provision will tie these countries' hands back from being able to determine fair use on their own, they will not be able to have fair use that allows certain videos to be shown at all. And so that's censorship through and through. And for example, in Chile, they passed a fairly progressive law in terms of, well, not progressive, but I guess balanced law that allows users to make sure that they have a judicial takedown notice to ensure that a judge will look at a case of infringement and determine if this is actually a legitimate case, and that provides some security for the users, and without that sort of judicial oversight, users could receive thousands of these notices, and I personally don't want to be afraid to look at anything that I want on the internet. And so if we all have to live in fear of infringing on copyright, depending on what link we click on, what video we watch, that is just going to change the internet and the freedom that we have with the internet in terms of the content that we can share, the stories that we can share, and that sort of fear just does not belong with this, liberating technology.
Exactly, and we've seen in some of the precedent cases here, the SOPA and PIPA, etc., that there's the threat of prosecution for even so much as linking to copyrighted material under some of these new IP regimes. Is there any indication of that in the TPP agreement?
Well, as I said, with that temporary copies provision, if you happen to click on the wrong link that's copyrighted, and they interpret that provision of the TPP to mean that you are not even allowed to save a temporary copy of this copyrighted video on your computer, then sure, that could actually...
So that would be the person clicking the link, but not the person hosting that link, then?
Right. Well, it depends. These provisions are so broad that the kinds of laws that they can be translated into domestic law in each of these countries, yes, it could be both the users' I guess accountability and the hosting provider's responsibility.
Well, you made such an important point earlier. I think we should maybe break that down a little bit more for the listeners out there, because it strikes me that this turns so much of judicial due process on its head, whereby the mere allegation of wrongdoing is enough to elicit some sort of police action of one sort or another, police action in quotes there, cyber police, I suppose. Whereas usually you're presumed innocent until proven guilty. In this case, it seems that you're presumed guilty until you're able to prove yourself innocent. And even then, there has been sites that have been taken down by the authorities, and even after it was proven that they were in the wrong, they basically get nothing for their the time that they spent down, and their websites have been basically destroyed. And of course, we can look to what's happened in Mega Upload as an even further example of this, where presumably of all of the people who were hosting files on that service, I'm sure there were many who were not infringing on copyright in any way, shape, or form whatsoever, but all of their files have been confiscated by the FBI and the authorities as well. So it leads to just an incredible overturning of what we would think of as any sort of legal due process. Why is this treated so differently to just general criminal law?
Well, I mean, you might see those advertisements that say, pirating is theft, and they have people breaking into cars or stealing a purse, and they are equating copyright with theft. And that is a fundamental problem, because the fact of the matter is we have these technologies that really facilitate sharing. And while it's very true that there's a lot of copyrighted content that is being downloaded illegally, and that does constitute some maybe profits going to the person that created that content. But to associate copyright and copyright content as property is a very hard stretch to make, because theft means that you steal someone from somebody and they no longer have it. But as with copyright, everybody has a copy, and so therefore it's a fundamentally different relationship to the content. And so the fact is that new technology is going to change the way business works, and the problem is that Hollywood studios, music industry, software companies, they don't want to face the fact that we are able to share content much more easily. And so it's really up to them, I mean, in our opinion, to look at new business models to facilitate, other profit models, so that we can feel like we are purchasing content, that we feel like we are getting a good product out of them, without feeling like they are, chasing after us with these over-restricted copyright policies. So really, it's these sort of entrenched businesses that can't look beyond how they've done business for years, and unfortunately, they are going after due process by pushing for these copyright policies that are so restrictive.
Unfortunately so. Well, there's another aspect of this that we haven't touched on yet that I think is important too, that there are provisions in some of these draft agreements that seem to indicate an escalation in protection for digital locks and DRM. Let's talk about that and the implications of some of these provisions.
Right. So digital locks are these tools on things like DVDs or software. You might see when you pop in a DVD that says, "Please do not copyright this. You will be charged if you do." And they put these locks there to make sure that people don't copy and sell it on the street. And the problem with that is that if you try to back up a disc that you have rightfully purchased, you actually might be charged with copyright infringement. So these digital locks can be broken. There are ways of circumventing those technologies. But what the TPP would do is to make the tools to break those circumvention measures illegal. So one very real example, we have had many stories of visually impaired and the blind who are trying to gain access to content such as an ebook, and they are trying to get an ebook to translate it into Braille or to audiobooks that they can listen to this book, and they might be found to be a criminal if they try to download these tools that allow them to break these locks on these content, because a lot of this content is available to them immediately. So that's just one example of the many, many ways in which even though the blind is actually allowed to break these digital locks for their purposes, that is law, but the actual tool for them to do that is illegal. So if they're blind or visually impaired and they have their own lives going on, how are they going to be able to build this code, these tools to break these digital locks themselves? And so that's just one example of how these digital locks are called digital rights management or technological protection measures. How those really restrict people's access to content.
It is just an outrageous example, but one that throws into stark relief the type of changes to the idea of property ownership that are taking place under the digital rights paradigm that they're trying to shoehorn in. And another outrageous example was that recently it was being reported that Bruce Willis was going to be suing Apple because he wanted to bequeath his iTunes music collection to his daughters or after he dies. But under the terms of agreement from the iTunes store, you're not allowed to do that. I believe that story was debunked, that Bruce Willis is not considering a lawsuit against Apple, but still it does point out that people do not own even the songs that they buy from the iTunes store. And these types of issues are becoming more important as this gets hardwired into law through these agreements. But let's step back for a moment. I think that we have seen, obviously, with SOPA and PIPA, that people can be motivated in a huge way to really step up and to speak out against these agreements, and they can influence the political process when they do so, especially when there's a large coordinated mass of people who are informed about the issue and passionate about it, which people are on these types of issues. But after SOPA and PIPA, there was talk of ACTA and now TPP. Unfortunately, it just seems to be a never-ending wave of these types of agreements and a war of attrition. What do you think about this, and what do you think the possibility of maintaining the opposition to this in the face of such relentless opposition is?
Well, unfortunately, as long as these industries feel a need to protect the way they've been, selling content, they're going to keep pumping money into putting lobbyists on the floor of Congress, into these trade negotiations, into WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization that deals with intellectual property policies around the world. They're going to be there, and they're going to be pushing for these, ridiculous, restrictive copyright policies as long as they're standing. And but there's a lot of hope. There's so many alternative business models that are popping up due to the fact that creators are actually much more empowered because of the internet. You see guys like Louis C.K., the comedian, who sold his whole show directly to the users. Actually, he said DRM free, and said, guys, like, I know you really like my work, and so please, give me money. I produced everything myself. I swear this isn't going to some third party. And people have a direct relationship with the artist, and so that is something that is unprecedented, and that is because of the internet. And he made a huge amount of money, more than he ever imagined, and he actually donated some of that to charities. But that's one example of how the internet is fundamentally changing our relationship with knowledge, with content, with creativity, and these entrenched businesses, I think, really recognize that threat to their business model, and instead of trying to adapt to these new ways of doing things, they're resisting, and they're kicking and screaming, and the way they're doing that is by trying to pass these laws, and so ultimately, I'm very hopeful that these new sorts of direct relationships between creators and users will develop and will continue to get stronger. But in the meantime, these laws still exist, and people are still getting their video shut off the internet. Their privacy is being infringed upon because of these. The hosting provider needs to watch them download content. There's all these very huge unintended consequences of these copyright laws that they do not speak of, and so it's our job to make sure that all these hundreds and thousands of people that are experiencing these awful outcomes of these copyright laws are representative in these international spaces.
Exactly right. Well, you made a lot of good points there. So we're coming up against the break, and so we'll wrap things up with you here, Maira. But let's just direct people to the EFF again and tell them about some of the resources there on the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
All right, so our main site is EFF.org. Our page on the TPP is www.eff.org/issues/TPP. And we also have a great infographic on TPP that we'd love for you to share, put on your blog. A lot of people unfortunately don't know about the TPP. So, tell your friends about it, tell your grandma about it, tell everyone that you know about this very powerful trade agreement. And, and there are many other implications of this agreement that aren't even digital rights issues. So
There's a lot going on. Sorry, we're going to have to leave it there, Maira. We're fresh out of time and fresh against the break here. So we're going to have to leave it there. But Maira Sutton, EFF.org, thank you so much for your time tonight. And I hope people will check out the EFF and the excellent work that's being done there.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, there goes Maira Sutton. Once again, I hope people will go and check out EFF.org for more on these issues. We'll be right back after this break.
I'm sick of this damn noise, the paranoid android poised at the edge of the precipice. Sanity is gradually...
All right, friends, welcome back to the program. Of course, you are tuned into Corbett Report Radio. Tonight, we've been talking to Maira Sutton of the EFF about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and some of the potential implications for international intellectual property law that come along with that. And there's a lot to go through. So again, I hope people will check into the resources that I'll post up at corbettreport.com/radio after tonight's broadcast airs, with links to some of the documents that you can use to get more information about this. And of course, the next round of TPP talks is taking place as we speak in Leesburg, Virginia right now, from today until the 15th of September. So more information will be coming out on this, and we'll be keeping our eye on it. I'd just like to stress something that Maira was pointing out there, that I think we have to start thinking about a non-copyright paradigm and how we can help to build that up by supporting artists like Louis C.K. and others out there who are doing work and selling it directly to customers and completely bypassing this whole copyright paradigm. I think that is really the future, and we have to think about ways to basically stop buying the Hollywood garbage that unfortunately we don't need, and unfortunately is being propped up by our own dollars. I think once again we vote with our dollars, and that's what's going to make the difference at the end of the day. But of course, we have to be aware of this new intellectual property rights regime that they are trying to slot in. But we have a caller waiting on the line, so let's go to him just before the end of the program here. We have Vince in New Jersey. Vince, thanks for your call tonight.
Mr. Corbett, hi, sir. I'm a new listener. Thanks for taking my call. I know you're almost out of time. I'm sorry crammed this in at the last minute, but I wanted to share an update with you.
Go ahead.
Could I give out a blog site so that you and your listeners can check out what I'm going to say to you?
Sure, go ahead.
Because I certainly don't want anyone to take my word for it. The blog is Help Stop the 9/11 Cover-Up. It's all one word with the numerals 9/11. Help Stop the 9/11 Cover-Up.blogspot.com. I'm just still working on it, but what I posted, what I learned in the last 4 or 5 days or so was that the Freedom of Information request that I filed with the FBI, well, actually the Armed Forces Medical Examiner's Office, forwarded my request to the FBI because I had heard, like most of us did, that Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon and the plane vaporized. So I wanted to know, how could there be an autopsy report if the passengers, if there were no bodies to examine because the plane and the contents, all the contents vaporized. So I sent a FOIA request to the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System, and they responded saying they don't release autopsy reports. And please, we defer your request to the FBI. Please consult with the FBI. So the FBI responds, we're not going to release them. It's a matter of privacy. Your appeal is denied, but they gave me 60 days to appeal. This is the standard FOIA process. What I learned last Friday, was that the FBI closed my case and did not bother telling me. You used to be able to call a FOIA officer and he or she would give you an update. Now you just punch in your case number online and it tells you where you are. It's electronic now, as opposed to you burdening them and talking to an officer over the phone. So I found out online that my case was closed. I called a few days ago. We played phone tag with the FBI records officer. They finally called back, leave me a message confirming that my case is closed. This is highly unusual. Never in 3 years has my case been closed without the FBI telling me in a letter The letter just said my request was denied, and I had 60 days to appeal it. So they closed my case behind my back.
Well,
Very unusual.
unfortunately, yeah, unusual, but perhaps not surprising. I know in the past the FBI has attempted to rule that all of their 9/11 records are off limits to FOIA requests. They've attempted to make that argument in court because it's national security. So I can't say it's surprising, but it is sad. I hope people will check into that website to take a look at that. I know they have pictures of some of the bodies that in the Pentagon, or allegedly in the Pentagon, but online. But I'm not sure where that came from or how we can determine if they won't show us any of the details about that data. So I salute you for the FOIA request. But Vince, we're going to have to leave it there. We are fresh out of time. So once again, this is James Corbett, CorbettReport.com.
Thanks for taking my call.
No problem. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, Vince, for your call. And I'm going to be here 23 hours from now, tomorrow night, to talk to you all again. Once again, talking to Grant Smith of ERMEP. So I hope you'll join me for that conversation. Until then, thanks for listening and take care.